Hello, everyone. I am Maria Perbellini, Dean of the School of Architecture and Design at New York Institute of Technology. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the Roundtable Expanding Critical Computational Thinking, centered on the themes presented in the Inform Interscalar Fluidity, an event that includes an exhibition curated by Marcella del Signore, Director of our MS in Architecture, Urban and Regional Design, with visiting assistant professor Sergio Elizondo, and a site-specific installation curated by Pablo Lorenzo-Eiroa, Director of our Master of Science in Architecture and Computational Technologies. I am delighted to welcome our distinguished panelists today. We have with us Ayla Berman, Dean and Professor of UVA School of Architecture, Alberto Estevez, Director of the Institute for Biodigital Architecture and Genetics from UIC in Barcelona, Christina Goberna Pesudo, hello everyone, founder of Fake Industries Architectural Agonism, FKAA, in Barcelona, New York, and Sydney. We have Branko Kolarevich, Dean of the Hillier College of Architecture and Design at NYIT. We have Frederic Levrat, Principal, Levrat Design LLC, and Visiting Associate Professor at Pratt Institute. And we have Andrew Saunders, Director of the Master of Architecture program at the Weizmann School of Design at UPenn. Our guests will be in conversation with Marcella and Pablo. Thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it that you accepted our invitation to join this great event. Inform Interscalar Fluidity is a collection of works by New York Tech School of Architecture and Design thesis students, and is part of a larger exhibition, Time, Space, Existence, running from May 22 to May 21st at the European Cultural Center in Palazzo Bembo in Venice. It is also an official collateral event of the 17th International Architecture Biennale 2021, curated by Hashim Sarkis, Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and conceived around the relevant question, how will we live together? Our school has the unique opportunity to participate in multiple forms through faculty and student works, researchers, architects and designers, contributions to this year's Architecture Venice Biennale, and to the Italian Pavilion, Resilient Communities, at the Tese delle Vergini in the Arsenale, sponsored and promoted by the Italian Ministry of Culture, General Direction for Contemporary Creativity, and curated by Alessandro Mellis. And I am absolutely pleased to announce that Alessandro will join NYIT as the newly appointed IDC Foundation Endowed Chair. Inform Interscalar Fluidity introduces us to an overview of design research, works, and reflections on the multiple significances of the relationship between architecture, urbanism, and computational processes that study material, structural, and responsive systems. A compelling display of design trajectories reveals design approaches to the integration of emerging technologies with the public, social, and cultural scales of the built environment, focusing on the urgency to address correlational crisis. Our leading participation in the Biennale, Venice Biennale 2021, propels our school's commitment to climate ambitions and actionable strategies for the reinvention of our cities, rebuilds a different approach to our economic resilience, and advances new knowledge while blurring disciplinary boundaries and working across fields and expertise. This difficult time has brought us the momentum to critically think about the future we want to have together and have a deeper conversation about change. As outstanding educators, researchers, and professionals, Marcella, Sergio, and Pablo's work is embedded in design studios and raises the question on data applications informing synthesis and computational thinking in design practices. It is an excellent contribution that fits very well with the aspiration and critical direction of our School of Architecture and Design at New York Tech. My warmest congratulations and admiration go to Marcella, Sergio, and Pablo, and our talented students for this production and selection of works, for invigorating computational thinking as a critical discourse, and for contributing to represent what we do and what is still in process of becoming. At the end of the program, please stay with us. We will be able to show some images of the exhibition and installation, as well as a preliminary version of a related publication with contribution from all our invited panelists today and our faculty. Thank you. Marcella and Pablo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dean Perbellini, for an extraordinary introduction, and thank you also for your leadership and for your series of organizations of events that make NYIT, New York Institute of Technology, at the foreground of such an international and important event. Welcome. Yes, thank you again, Maria. Welcome and good morning and afternoon to our guests, students, faculty, alumni, colleagues, and friends. Thank you for joining us this morning at our New York Institute of Technology, School of Architecture and Design. On behalf of Dean Maria Perbellini, Chair Giovanni Santamaria, and the Lectures and Events Committee, I would like to welcome you to this Lectures and Events series for the spring 2021 semester. My name is Pablo Lorenzo-Eiroa, and I am the Chair of the Lectures and Events Committee and Associate Professor at New York Tech School of Architecture and Design. Today, we will discuss the content of the exhibition curated by Associate Professor Marcella Signore with visiting Associate Assistant Professor Sergio Elizondo, and the site-specific installation curated by myself, which we are both supported by Dean Maria Perbellini's fund and contribute to the Dean's development of progressive design thinking and cross-disciplinary computational technologies. The installation and exhibition Inform Interscalar Fluidity expands computational thinking across disciplines and scales. New York Institute of Technology, School of Architecture and Design is participating, as Dean Perbellini said, of the 17th International Architecture Venice Biennale in various forms, events, exhibitions, and installations, and also discussions which will be posted and be part of the virtual Italian Pavilion platform, Cities X, curated by Alessandro Melis and Tom Kovac, which the creative director on behalf of New York Institute of Technology is our Dean Maria Perbellini. Expanding critical computational thinking, today's event is a roundtable discussion which will be centered on the themes that the Inform Interscalar Fluidity exhibition and installation propose. The installation develops an interactive, immersive space environment, re-challenging and recalibrating issues of ecological concern at the scale of the space and in relationship to landscape, but in terms of the scale of the small exhibition space at Palazzo Bembo. The installation develops immersive tensions between real space and augmented virtual illusionistic representation through computational design, artificial intelligence, but also working out simulations of various types, from environmental simulation to structural and material simulation, thinking form as structure, but also coordinated and correlated with robotic interaction, social interaction, and informed robotic fabrication, working out synthetic ecologies in relationship to the space of the installation. Now, my curatorial partner and colleague, Associate Professor Marcella Signore, will introduce the exhibition and the speakers.
Thank you. Thanks, Dean Perbellini, and thanks, Pablo, and thanks to all of you for being here. So good morning and good afternoon for those of you in Venice. It's a pleasure to be here and share this event with everyone. Inform interscalar fluidity, so the exhibition at time-space existence expand computational thinking across disciplines and scale, from the material to the building to the urban scale. The New York Institute of Technology School of Architecture and Design, led by Dean Maria Perbellini, with the exhibition and installation developed with this student, is curated, as the Dean and Pablo already mentioned, by myself and visiting assistant professor Sergio Elizondo. In the exhibition, students worked across a range of scale and systems at the urban level. A series of research topics, including computation and simulation, were offered as an extended field of investigation to explore the design continuum from the architectural scale to larger design scenario. So we're very pleased today to have an amazing group of panelists, as Dean Perbellini already introduced. And again, I want to thank everyone for being here and for participating in this event. Today's event participants and the roundtable discussion are Ayla Berman, Dean of the School of Architecture and Professor at UVA, University of Virginia, presenting multi-agent systems and the project of transcoding. Alberto Estevez, Director of Biodigital Architecture, Master Program at UIC in Barcelona, presenting interscalar fluidity fascinations. Christina Goberna Pesudo, Co-Director of Fake Industries, presenting the resistance of potential of simulation. Branko Kolarevich, Dean, Hilliard College of Architecture and Design, NYIT, presenting Design Democratization, the Unfulfillment Promise of Mass Customization. Frederick Levrat, Visiting Associate Professor at Pratt Institute, presenting Virtual, Visual, Physical Environments. And Andrew Saunders, Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, Stuart Weitzman School of Design, presenting The Painterly in the Age of Brute Force Computing. Thanks again to all of you for your participation. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. And after the introduction, we will proceed with 10-minute presentation for each of the panelists. We will start from Ayla Berman, Dean of the School of Architecture and Professor at UVA, presenting multi-agent systems and the project of transcoding. Ayla will present the evolution of contemporary practices driven by computational thinking more broadly and a context for the exhibition more specifically. Through the idea of multi-agent system, the project of transcoding, and generic design practices that have transformed design practice. In particular, she will give an overview of three seemingly distinct manifestations of nonlinear multi-agent systems: discretized agglomerative systems, continuous multi-agent matters, and interactive multi-agent environments, and discuss their principles and logics, all which are applied to the work developed for the exhibition. Dr. Ayla Berman is the Dean of the School of Architecture at UVA and Principal of Scale Shift Design. She's an architect, theorist, and curator of architecture and urbanism, whose research investigates the relationship between culture and the evolution of contemporary material and technological and spatial practices. She's a featured alumni of Harvard University Grounded Visionaries series and the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including the Lieutenant Governor's Medal for Design, American Institute of Architects Awards, and Tulane University President's Award for Excellence in Teaching, among others. Berman is the founder and director of the Next Cities Institute, an interdisciplinary research center focused on the design of global urban futures, and the editor of Next Cities book series. Her publication includes Expanded Field, Architectural Installation Beyond Art, Flux, Architecture in a Parametric Landscape, Urban Build, Local, Global, and New Constellations, New Ecology. Her work and installation have been exhibited in many galleries and museums, among them the 2006 and 2018 Venice International Architecture Biennale. Welcome, Ayla. The stage is all yours.
Thank you, Marcella. Thank you, Maria and Pablo. I'm going to just share my screen. I'm hoping you can see.
Yes.
That's great. So as Marcella said, I'm going to talk about multi-agent systems and give a little bit of theoretical context for the way in which I understand the phrase. From the last decade of the 20th century until today, computational technologies have continued to significantly influence architectural practice. They've evolved from being advanced representational tools invested in the depiction of existing models of architectural space to becoming significant performative machines that have transformed the ways that we think about, conceive, configure, and interact with form, space, and material. These technologies have enabled the emergence of parametric practices that emulate genetic and iterative dynamic evolutionary processes, changing the ways that we integrate different types of information into the design process, as well as the methodologies that directly influence the generation and analysis of form, as well as the manipulation of materials and their fabrication into components and larger assemblies. From the design of structural building skins that might modulate light while encoding a capillary branching field to channel gravity, to the transformation and seeming dissolution of structure itself through a gradient field of attenuated hair-like columns. One of the most significant transformations within this evolution, amplified by the shift from the mechanical to the computational paradigm, has been the move from the programming of artifacts and robotics to the production of complex multi-agent networks and cyber-physical systems. The latter being constituted by computationally controlled devices, augmented with communicative capacity and also network connectivity. This evolution has enabled the emergence not only of data-driven design processes and fabrication methods, but also of what are referred to as smart objects and environments, material things that interact with people and other physical and virtual objects by embedding context-aware sensors, controllers, and computing devices into physical sites that allow them to transcode and integrate a wide range of inputs in real time while also operating autonomously. Multi-agent networks, for me, a phrase that within contemporary computational practice might equally apply to the complexity of physical things, as well as to their processes of making, which includes anticipatory forms of material computation. The Balnoches image from a project Feathered Edge, for me, is a form of material computation itself. These refer to intelligent, decentralized systems that are composed of relatively discrete elements, each of which operates as an independent actor within a dynamic, larger collective. These systems are notable for their ability to generate complex global behavior that emerges through the interactive agglomeration of a set of local rules applicable to each agent within the network. And initially evolving from the computer simulation of swarming, schooling, and flocking activities found in insect, fish, and bird migrations, such as the early Boyd's program that was developed by Craig Reynolds in 1986, multi-agent networks have been used to model a wide range of phenomena, and outside of, but also including architecture and urbanism. And these include things like the behavioral life of ecosystems, the diffusion of global innovation and economics, the spread of disease, like what we've just encountered with COVID in epidemiology, the cultural transmission of populations in anthropology, and the mapping and anticipation of traffic patterns in urban infrastructure. In addition, the intensive application of swarm behavior simulations to more continuous self-organizing systems, such as multicellular processes in biology, have transferred their deployment to the realm of artificial life and the study of self-assembly, morphogenetic growth and development, as well as evolutionary and ecological dynamics. Within the design disciplines, these behaviors found in nature have become new paradigmatic models for us, for rethinking architecture and urbanism as a dynamic multi-agent network where the complexity of their global patterns and adaptive and performative capacities emerge from a series of local interactive rules. Now, given their dependence on open-ended algorithmic procedures that define coded relationships between individual elements rather than prescribing a larger set of overarching formal geometries or types, the application of such data-driven and rule-based logics to architecture have produced an incredibly wide range of practices, many of which operate as either what I'll call multi-agent matters or multi-agent systems, both of which are applicable to the informed interscalar fluidity installation. Here, architecture is imagined as a form of artificial life, constituted over time by self-organizing elements whose local parameters determine behaviors that simulate generative patterns of form growth and development. Components within this system are both created and arrayed using local rule sets that are applied either to discrete elements or to a continuous formal or material matrix. And these local rules parametrically adjust each element or collection of elements within the system in relation to its neighbors, so that the architecture that gets created, which in the end subscribes to no overarching global geometric order, becomes a residual material trace, like the termite mound itself, of the morphogenetic evolution of the system over time. Now, how we perceive the difference between multi-agent systems, for example, or multi-agent matters is dependent on their scale of operation, the degree of discretization or continuity of their components, whether they're made up of individual parts or they're seen as a continuous system. That is, whether the swarm or algorithmic procedure generates a continuous material growth or an aggregate of distinct cells or elements, how the material or how the system is materialized or rendered visible in space, and the way in which temporality is defined within the system. This last condition, for me, underscores the categorical difference between fluid, formal, or material movements of a generative process that ultimately produce a reified, fixed, and immobile artifact, no matter how perceptually animate it still might appear, and a multi-agent system that I would say retains the trajectory of time within the potential multitude of projective scenarios that it might produce. So in the first case, time gets registered in the procedural traces of the final architectural artifact, which in the end is no longer fluid, mobile, or adaptive, just as the growth of natural objects retain the traces of material events within their very formation. But in the second case, time is maintained as the performative environment of the multi-agent network, just like in a game, when the game's virtual envelope refers not only to the categorical rules and distributing hypotheses of the game, but also to the temporality and plurality of all possible plays and aggregated outcomes determined by the rules of interaction and constraints of the system, which, like the EZCT chair project, there is sort of an infinite number of possibilities that come out. And in this sense, the network can be understood to constitute a multi-dimensional manifold that contains within itself all possible states intrinsic to the dynamic behavior of the system. Finally, there are also interactive multi-agent systems that are programmed to operate continuously in time, and thus are performative and adaptable within a prescribed set of limits. And these endow surfaces, structures, and spaces with a sensory intelligence and an actuating capacity facilitated by a multitude of locally responsive elements that collectively enable the production of mediated or artificial atmospheric environments. Now, whether one is referring to the extended body of generative parametric design practices, expanded models of computationally driven modes of fabrication, or the production of interactive systems, certain key phenomena are critical in their capacity to expand our architectural imagination. Most important, perhaps, is the way in which the active design, I would say, has been fundamentally redefined as a genetic generative practice. Traditional mimetic forms that, or methods that draw upon the repetition of typologies or the manipulation of fixed geometric spatial systems are now displaced with numerically and relationally driven dynamic computational procedures. And these yield architectural products according to the fluctuations of a new topological model that permits, in the end, infinite mutability and differentiation. Complexity is generated through the synthetic growth of this topological envelope or system, which acts as a material index that mediates encoded internal and external parameters, internal programmatic directives, as well as external environmental forces and constraints. And I could say that within this context in the exhibition, those external forces or environmental forces can also be the effects of gravity, for example, in the material making of this artifact. And that through their local interaction, these internal and external parameters, this leads towards the generative development and diversification of the architectural form and its morphology. And although within this context, the design process has been entirely reconceived, for me now, at this point in time, the true intelligence of the architecture produced is not simply a result of computational calisthenics or the quantity of numerical data that's now pulsing through the system, but rather the design of the multi-agent system itself, which is the intelligence of the parameters that are selected and the rules generated to govern local behaviors, the quantity and complexity of formal and programmatic and environmental inputs, and the forces that the system is able to absorb and respond to, the ways in which internal and external stimuli get transcoded across distinct formal and material domains, the points at which procedures get halted within the evolutionary system, and finally, the selection of resulting elements considered to be successful manifestations of this new architectural order. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayla Berman, for such a great presentation, very well informed and with some history and theory of computation. I thought it was great. Thank you so much. Now we're going to proceed to our next speaker, Alberto Estevez, who's going to present Interscalar Fluidity Fascinations. And I'm going to read a small description of Alberto's presentation and then proceed to introduce him more formally. The history of art and architecture is actually the history of human fascination, spread from one to the another. And on the other hand, fluidity as an abstract concept and due to people's associative and metaphorical capacity has been one of the eternal mirrors of inspiration in art and architecture. Quote by Estevez, 2014. Meanwhile, if any authentic, singular, and specific specialty has been the architect's profiled in a unique way, it is the domain of scale, the interscalar ability, which can create from a spoon to a city, Estevez, 2016. This has now expanded to create from a DNA and a bit to an entire planet, either biological and or digital. Interscalar fluidity fascinations that we could verify according to a specific conceptual and chronological line from Brunelleschi through Alberti to Borromini and to the computational design simulations facilitated by the computational technologies of the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century that we are in already. Alberto Estevez is an architect with double PhD and studies, architecture and art history. He heads over the Office of Architecture and Design in Barcelona, his own office, and was teaching architecture design, theory, and arts in different universities until he founded the ETS-ARC at UIC in Barcelona, the School of Architecture there. In 1996, where he's the chairman professor of architecture after being its first director. He then founded also as director the UIC PhD programs in architecture and the 2000 biological architecture master degree, biodigital architecture master degree, and the genetic architecture research group and office, included in the IBAG UIC Barcelona Institute for Biodigital Architecture and Genetics, of which he is the director. He was also Vice Chancellor, General Manager of UIC Barcelona, Universitat Internacional de Catalunya. He has written more than 200 publications and has been participated in a large number of exhibitions, congresses, committees, invited to give more than 100 lectures around the world, presenting his ideas, research projects, and works of architecture and design. Welcome, Alberto, to our event.
Hey, thank you, Pablo. Thank you for your invitation, of course, and will be great to present some ideas or some concepts here, maybe for discuss or after this great synthesis that you'll have to do now. I think maybe I need to share the here compartir, I think is this, but maybe I can share first this, because is I don't know if you are now saying this the channel of Venice. Yes, yeah, because we speak about fluidity and we are in the city of the fluidity, because all is flowing, and it's interesting that that in every city the people walk, but they need to stop when the cars walk, the cars go. But here not. Here never the people stop because they go to bridges. So it's the city really where everyone is influenced. But when they was introducing I think you see the letters here of the article. Yes, I think, yeah. Okay, so the words interscalar fluidity, or the words thinking, computational thinking, what this makes me think now, because from one side I can share my different experiences about these questions. For example, now Pablo was reading this first part of the article, that is from a spoon to a city, as the paradigm that the modern movement was thinking, that they need to design absolutely all from, but the modernism people have this range of action. The range, they can only design from the spoon to a city. But now we can design from DNA and from the bit to an interplanet. And when I see these people that we go to Mars, we will be big colonies with a lot of money, etc., I think no, we can create our planets here around the world. Not we don't need to go so far, 3 years of a long trip. We can now have the tools for really think in the creation of an interplanet. So we have the tools for control from the DNA and the bit to an interplanet. So the range of action is now growing. Infinite horizons that opens. Yeah. From other side, this idea of interscalar fluidity makes me think, of course, the fascination that humans have about fluidity, about how water flows, because have something aesthetical attraction, or how smoke flows, or how the physical and chemical morphogenetic laws organize the world in fluidities ways that humans perceive as something that is interesting, that is attractive, is magnetic to see. And for us now we have tools that allows a big fluidity in our interscalar action. So from one side, if you think that where I have writing this, about the interscalarity, if you think architects and designers are the only one discipline that allows this fluidity between scales of things. Really, we can act from the most little thing until the thinking in the big landscapes. So, and other disciplines are very much concentrated in a very specific scale. So this gives us, in the interscalar action, a big chance, a big advantage over other disciplines. But if you see in the history, when about this interscalar fluidity, and we come, yes, to when Brunelleschi invented or discovered the laws of the perspective, it's interesting to see that Vassar himself understand as he found a method. And from one side, this method makes you be sure in how you act, because it's a very objective method, as we have now with digital tools. And when you explain the words computational thinking, I am imagining me as, okay, the computers will think for me. So humans don't need to think more. And this is very comfortable. We can be in holidays all the day. Machines will work for us because it's computational thinking age. From the other side, it was interesting to see how Pablo and with the school and with the was taking attention in the work of Borromini, because as you see, yes, Brunelleschi put this possibility to organize the fluidity of the space for first time from two dimension to 3 dimension in a very objective way. This means in a harmonical way, mathematically considered. But the step of Borromini is that go inside of the rules of the optical organization of the 3 dimensions. And with this knowledge of the optical rules, he gives this step more, that he used the optical tricks as he was organizing in reference of the Palazzo Spada in Rome. So if you know more the optical rules, you are able to build a whole project somehow scratching very much these rules for have some results that only knowing these rules you can arrive. So this happens today, only knowing our rules of the computational thinking, we can do all what you have now explained. The formal systems based on augmented perspective, shapes of projects based on simulations such as swarm intelligence, structural simulation, material simulation in relation to the temperature of environment, etc., etc. All this gives us objective approaches, mathematical approaches, that mathematical objectivity in representation that make sure the harmony of the representation. And if you see in the past, interesting to see how the Borromini was associated with a mathematician, Giovanni Maria David Tonto, for do the project of the Palazzo Spada, as the Alberti is also speaking when he's speaking about the perspective rules, he's speaking about mathematics. And when he said, having to write about painting in these brief comments, the author will start from mathematicians. So, and now we need the programmers. And this makes me think also when I was beginning with with the digital tools 35 years ago, when I was fascinating in 1985 with the first possibilities of graphical representation of architecture with Fortran 4, and I was making a lot of letters and sheets for having the little and prehistoric perspective of my first little house. And now you see that you may click and wow, you have the amazing representations. So, but this speak about fascinations that allows us to have our work as related with our times, this is what I was finishing the article telling that the Borromini, the Palazzo Spada of Borromini is really a son of their time, because only in this time he knows this understanding, and he can conceive and think and create. And as in our time, computational thinking allows us to do something that before was impossible. As before Borromini time, it was impossible to design Palazzo Spada. Before our time, it's impossible to conceive and to create what we are conceiving and creating. As, for example, I am using also the integrating biology with the scanning electron microscope for taking the forms of physiology, applying with scripting, for make our panels, our pavilions, or integrating the real biology, working directly with real DNA, for have also our genetic projects, or when we are acting with material in material level, when now we are researching with bioprinting, with really printing with cells, alive cells, for thinking in architecture and design. So, okay, so thank you, and regards from Venice.
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you for your presentation. And I look forward to engage with the teams in your conversation as you talk specifically also about the microscale, really starting from this notion of interscalarity from the DNA level. So this, I think, is something that we can bring into the discussion afterwards. Thanks, Alberto, again. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Christina Goberna Pesudo. She's the founding partner at Fake Industry, Architectural Agonism, Epic Architecture, and the Institute. She will present the resistance potential of simulation. In her presentation, she will talk about how architecture has been historically subject to a regime of originality, and yet simulation, appropriation copies, and related actions are creative strategies that contradict this logic. Also, she will talk about how simulation and multiscalarity could be described in the conversation on the politics of care and the construction of resistance against oppression through creative thoughts. Christina Goberna Pesudo is a New York and Barcelona-based architect, critic, and educator, and the founder of Fake Industry Architectural Agonism, Epic Architecture, and the Institute. Her work explores through building, text, photography, and pedagogy the potential of agonism to unveil issues often overlooked by the architectural field. After teaching at Columbia, GSAPP, Sydney, UTS, MIT, and the Cooper Union, she's currently a visiting lecturer at the Royal College of Art in London, and faculty member at BAU Barcelona, and a PhD candidate at the European Graduate School in Switzerland. Thank you, Christina, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Marcella, Maria, Perbellini, and Lorenzo-Eiroa. It's my pleasure to be here and to share time with this very prestigious panel. I'm going to share my screen. If you don't see different slides, let me know, because I have different slides, okay?
Yes.
Okay. So, share. Do you see my presentation?
Yes, we do see.
Okay. Okay, so the title of my presentation is The Resistance Potential of Simulation. All right, so let's go. Act 1. We might say that architecture, more than other disciplines, is subject to a regime of originality. operations having in common the recourse to already produced forms such as appropriation, détournement, objet trouvé, mashup, parafiction, copying, cloning, duplicating, faking, falsifying, imitating, impersonating, appropriating, reenacting, remaking, remixing, replicating, or reproducing, etc., are critical tools in a wide range of artistic production, but remain in architecture as well-known taboos. While imitation and reproduction are obvious roots in the last 20, if not the last 600 years of excess architectural shapes, this field has resisted openly embracing them, hindering in doing so its own potential. There are, of course, exceptions that celebrate the arts of simulation, although not necessarily always in terms of form. In 2018, Lian Yong, in the roundtable that followed the opening of his exhibition at the Arthur Ross Gallery in Columbia University, I mean, I was in the panel, and he explained how his work illustrated mostly through fictional love stories, films, the appropriation of future technologies of control by groups that resisted oppression. In his film, In the Root Skies, this is one of the slides of the film, and this is the other, a teenager girl is under drone surveillance locked down in a residential tower. Everything seems so familiar with the lockdown. I mean, I really recommend the film that it's online. And she has her own drone which surpasses police control to send a love letter to a boyfriend who lives nearby. And in his other film titled Where the City Can't See, and you have a slide here on the screen, groups of youngers design and build intelligent capes that simulate nature in pattern, holding a technology that would allow them to go unnoticed via aerial police control as they part to forbidden dance parties in the forest. Here's another slide. So appropriation, mimesis, simulation, and similar creative strategies could be tools against oppression. 2. Often, computational-based design is confronted with the identification of technology as lack of tradition, of sharing values with neoliberal markets, or a potential military use of its achievements and research, an old question that belongs to a long tradition of blaming technological progress for all dangers that we have heard so many times, you know, in juries, etc. In fact, through the appropriation of software that wasn't willingly created for architecture, we could investigate and share knowledge of how to fabricate FPP2 masks for medical use when the world is sinking in a deadly global pandemic. We can simulate nature logics of growth to generate very sophisticated and beautiful objects, or design complex topological forms for luxury skyscrapers. We can do everything. So as always, it is not the technology, but what you do with it, what should be maybe the object of our attention. Act 3. For Donna Haraway, caring means becoming subject to the unsettling obligation of curiosity, which requires knowing more at the end of the day than at the beginning. To care, she writes, is thinking with, dissenting within, and thinking for, 3 actions that seems ultimately intertwined with the very idea of curiosity. Curious comes from the Latin word, comes from the Latin word curiosus, which qualifies something as careful and inquisitive. The idea of curiosity, therefore, seems like the perfect opposite of a classic neoliberal agenda, unless, of course, there is proper profit at hand, in which case, we all know, it unfolds endless resources to study the potential profitable matter. So we could therefore say that the studies and actions that lead to authorless design, a feature of the ad hoc sharing digital culture, were crystallized in the efforts that numerous underground university groups did in the creation and fabrication of medical equipment through COVID-19, and still are. I was part of one in Europe, are pure acts of curiosity and care. And here we see students, very generous students from the New York Institute of Technology doing exactly that, no? And more prototypes that are exhibited in the exhibition. Act 4. investigations that work in looking at the world in a different manner, like a number of computational design types, especially those with which acknowledge error and uncertainty, are based in logic far from productivity. They put their force in adjunctional tests and are not focused in the immediate resolution of problems. Therefore, are straight examples of creative thoughts as acts of resistance. And here are more examples from the exhibition. Susan Sontag, in her essay Against Interpretation, vindicated the mere contemplation of art in this sensual side and the sensitivity of the author, leaving aside the urge to find its meaning. In the work featured in this exhibition, apart from the sometimes exuberance and beauty of forms, we could definitely find the other side of Susan Sontag's argument if we look at it closely, actually. A rare architectural research based in simulation and a relentless curiosity of the limits of technology and representation, and a spirit of care in historically global difficult times, which might be an excellent answer to the how will we live together biennial premise in retrospect that we might find. And I'm going to just show 5 or 6 slides of work that I have done in the last year that actually deal with the rejection of originality that I was mentioning at the beginning of my talk, with simulation, with different technologies, and with relentless love, let's say, for testing different scenarios, climate condition, etc. This is the OE house that is built in Catalonia, and actually it's a montage of 2 houses, one study house, Californian study house, and one a house, bourgeois house from Le Corbusier. And this is the result that is already built. This is the velodrome for the city of Medellin. That was the first prize of a competition. The work was, the project was already submitted, and they actually copied this model that was created by Le Ricollet, the engineer, the French engineer that worked in jail for such a long time. We also work with lawyers in order to give the city of Medellin the right to copy this model around without even our permission. This is the Helsinki Museum finalist proposal, the Guggenheim Museum for Helsinki. And here we propose different climate conditions. So we use simulation in order to create different scenarios. And we rejected design. So the work was named 47 Rooms. It's just 47 rooms. And finally, this is a film that is called Armar Grief, that is in YouTube if someone is interested, by the Destitute Institute, where we literally appropriated or copied, well, more appropriated and copied, the representation by the architect's data, the Neufeld, that, as you know, have a very dark past with the Nazis also, in order to talk about the thousands of people that disappeared during the civil war in Spain. And this is one other slide of the film. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina.
Thank you so much, Christina, for such a variety of themes and a cultural project in relationship to the themes of the installation and the exhibition. Now we're going to proceed to have Frederick Lebrat's presentation. To quote Fred, as he considers architecture as a design of the constructed environment, we should clearly recognize the current attempt to shape and design not only our physical environment, but also our non-physical environment. The virtual environment, as Henri Bergson would describe the constitution of our perception filters designed by Hollywood, religions, or even Instagram, as well as the design of the visual environment as a set of conventions to recognize and decipher abstract information forming a meaningful language as designed and constructed. Nevertheless, the power of architecture resides in the complex negotiation of these 3 layers of our reality, where the attempted autonomy of the design is confronted to the physical body once it is entered back into the physical dimension. NYIT Lorenzo-Eiroa studio decides to exist precisely at the intersection of these 3 environments and generates a set of fascinating research and experiments together with the exhibition by Marcella and Signore, where there is no clear hierarchy between the virtual, visual, and physical layers. Frederick Lebrat holds a master in architecture from Lausanne Federal Institute of Technology in Switzerland. Established in New York for over 30 years, Lebrat has received numerous awards such as the New York Foundation for the Arts in Architecture, the Young Architects Forum, and the European 5 First Prize. Fred Lebrat is a passionate educator, having taught architecture studio for 20 years at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, as well as Pratt Institute, exploring the finer relationship between visual, virtual, and physical spaces at the scale of material and tactile perception. Lebrat has lectured in Japan, France, Switzerland, China, United Arab Emirates in Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Jordan, as well as in the US, and has produced a number of projects recognized internationally, from audacious large tower design for Dubai and Abu Dhabi to research center for the European Space Agency in Switzerland, but also some humanitarian projects in Afghanistan, building 8 primary schools, 12 clinics. Fred Lebrat founded the international group RX in 1988 and established RX New York in 1990, RX Geneva in 1997. His international projects are currently developed under the RX New York name, with smaller residential projects are developed under Lebrat Design Consultants. Recently, Fred Lebrat published 2 books related to his teaching in Milan about the urban canals and in Lugano regarding the influence of new technologies over the public spaces. Lebrat's work can be found in the internet at lebratdesign.com. Welcome, Fred, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you very much, Maria, Marcella, and Pablo for having me here today. And it's a great panel to be part of. So I might as well share my screen right away. Let me see how we do that. Do you see my screen? Why can't I have full screen? Here we go. So as introduced, yes, have been fascinated and I've been working for many years on this idea of how do we negotiate virtual, visual, and physical environment. We're living in an interesting time nowadays where we are not clear, there's an international debate, at least in the United States, of what kind of reality we're living in, what are fact, what is real, what is not a lie or result or pandemic or any of those questions. Depending on which information platform you are, you might think your environment is one way or another. So even so, this historical condition of the virtual, visual, and physical environment are rooted in multiple years of condition. I think those last few decades have been really interesting, as the virtual has emerged as this really strong component of our environment. I'm looking at architecture as this possibility to negotiate as an interface between the mind and the body, between the virtual and the physical. And I think it's really interesting that the studio that Pablo and Marcella started with are based on this representation or this materialization of a representation. I mean, Borromini, by setting up this kind of historical precedent, the studio kind of provide an ambiguous hierarchy. How those 3 strata of virtual, visual, and physical generate space? What is the hierarchy? How do we negotiate between those layers? How do we define virtuality? I think there are a lot of different definition of it. But I really have appreciated the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, which kind of combined some of my understanding of virtuality, also related to Henry Bergson book Matter and Memory. But I think this quote from Harari is pretty clear. Ever since the cognitive revolution, sapiens have thus been living in a dual reality. On the one hand, the objective reality of river, tree, and lion, and on the other hand, the imagined reality of gods, nation, and corporation. As time went by, the imagined reality became ever more powerful, so that today, the very survival of river, tree, and lion depend on the grace of imagined entities such as the United States and Google. So not only it's a interesting and complex reversal between, let's say, imagined reality or virtual entity, but as we see that those virtual entities literally threaten and destroy our physical environment. So those strategies of ambiguity or reversal between the virtual and the physical have been explored by artists mostly, but also by architects. We have here a clear example by Felice Varini, who kind of let us enjoy the easiness of having a recognizable image, even so it's a much more complex condition. But our brain is kind of tempted to read the simplicity, the clear geometry. Henry Bergson in 1896, so quite some time ago, wrote a very interesting book called Matter and Memory, where he really tried to see how we are actively seeing, we are actively projecting understanding of our environment. In fact, representation, as we know it, is a direct, we construct our understanding of our environment, and representation is a culturally constructed condition. That cultural constructed condition, therefore, is something that is designed, is produced. And I think if we look at architecture as a constructed environment, therefore the virtual, the visual, and the physical constructed environment, we should look at who is designing our perception filter. How do we design the virtual environment? Now, the entire industry, like Hollywood or religions or new platforms such as Instagram and so on, who have been very good at generating imagery or educating our perception filter to kind of recognize, understand things that we give value to. I mean, this is very interesting, and I could have used some more recent example that you probably all know well about reality TV actor who are becoming president. But I kind of like the evolution of Arnold Schwarzenegger, who got elected to a real position from being basically Terminator. So the virtuality takes over the physicality. Now those consequences are absolutely real and serious and strong. I mean, strategy of the virtual, of the visual, well elaborated, well documented, created a massive destruction of our physical environment with absolutely devastating condition over century-old civilization, as much as very real human life. Now, oops, maybe I went too fast. Now, this strategy we can see around the world is being used to kind of please our mind, building for the pleasure of the mind as much as building for the pleasure of the space, of the body, of the community. I mean, I have been following the development of Dubai, which is really interesting, where there's a advertising, a propaganda, PR machine that sells image, which are very easy to understand, very easy to construct in our mind and please our mind in that sense. And so every construction has a name, a story, a marketing manager, and a sign lifestyle, a virtuality that is therefore clearly constructed and sold. If you read here on small, it say that Palm Jumeirah is 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers. That's the same size as the city of San Francisco. It was built over 5 years. So kind of 2,000 villas were sold over 48 hours online as perfect prototype. Now, it's interesting because when the virtuality is a generating condition over the physical, when you start building it, well, you have some slight problems such as scale or what is water, what is beach, are they actual beaches or just representation of beaches? And I must say I've been fascinated by Dubai because I don't think this is an absurd problem. I think it's our reality where those layers of virtuality, visuality, and physicality come as this complex system that we organize, that we negotiate. But it certainly raises a question: what does it mean to live in an image? I mean, in New York City, we know well some part of the town where the image become dominant over the physical building. It's also very interesting that if you look at the value of the visuality versus the value of the physicality, vertical square feet are more expensive to rent than horizontal square feet. Therefore, the physical body is not as important as the visual consumption of the surface. I'm going to go through a very quick example of some recent architect. I mean, obviously Borromini, or we could have even taken Michelangelo and other historical example that have been fascinating. But it's kind of interesting to look at Bernard Tschumi trying to see how gravity can be questioned if you insist on the visual condition of the image. Here for his video Pavilion in Groningen in the 90s, or also 89, 90s, Peter Eisenman looking at the indexical condition of the grid, not only as a structural support, but also sometimes not as a structural support, just as a mental or visual index, which created lots of reaction where people were really upset that physicality was not the primary system of organization, suddenly, as shown by this suspended column. We could have looked at Hadid, who used representation in conjunction with a multiplicity of field of vision, etc., to create an actual physical condition. Or maybe more recently, in the early 2000s, Dillon and Scofidio looking at capture through digital image and acceleration of space and participation in space through imagery, and also surface of the image just as kind of a continuous two-dimensional tectonic, as Neil Denary here in the Endeavor Agency exhibition. So the tectonic of the architecture is quite important, but I think it also raised question, and if I have time, I would like to go quickly over how this kind of information scape, this data scape, is even threatening our physical environment. Do we need city, as William Mitchell has suggested in City of Bits? How do we negotiate this kind of data scape, this incredible collection of information that we all supplies happily through all the interface that we're working within? There's been discussion of what's the role of the city, what's the role of the constructed environment? Do we need our concrete jungle? Interestingly, cities are generating information from the stock market to events to whatever, you know, basketball game, concert, kind of capturing the number of information related events from Olympic Games, etc. And I have put together this kind of theory of the knowledge city, that data without context is meaningless. And in fact, in opposition to what William Mitchell was saying, that the city will disappear, in fact, we see the opposite. People are migrating to cities to, in fact, have an actual physical context where they can navigate, negotiate those virtual, visual, and physical environment. So the knowledge city is where information can be contextualized and can be explored, can be challenged between the visual and the physical environment. In fact, the highest industry that has grown in the very competitive center of cities like Manhattan and New York City is the education branch, where universities such as Columbia, NYU, NYIT, Cooper Union, etc., have all expanded their campus because people want to develop information knowledge and explore and see how that can be organized. So I have been really interested and impressed by how the studio and the exhibition at NYIT for the Venice Biennale is really trying to exist precisely at that intersection of those three environments, trying to develop a digital computer generated algorithm which try to have as much autonomy while pushing the limit of the autonomy also is being built at a real physical scale, is being built certainly with gravity, is being built with a experiential environment of an exhibition, and it allows us to see how we negotiate, how do we appreciate the construction and the limit and the interaction between what I would call those three layers of the virtual, visual, and physical dimension. And I think it's absolutely essential. And I think architecture can regain a certain power in a way by operating in those interstitial spaces and has kind of an ethical duty, because I think our profession is able to be in between those layers to test, investigate, and explore how our environment today is constructed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frederick, for your presentation. And I think very interesting, introducing in particular the relationship between the visual and the virtual, but also talking about how do we design virtual environments, but also how we navigate datascapes. So these are all themes for discussion afterwards. Thank you again. So now present the next speaker, Branko Kolarevich. Branko is the Dean of Hillier College of Architecture and Design at NYIT, and is presenting Mass Customization and Design Democratization. Branko's lecture addressed the current state of mass customization in architecture and design, and the implicit promise of design democratization that has yet to find full social and cultural resonance. He discusses what massive customization means in architecture and the building industry, and how it can be manifested in its most commoditized sector, suburban housing. Also examine what kind of mass customization is possible, useful, and desirable, and the condition that could make design democratization a promising social and cultural construct. It explores whether design democratization enabled by mass customization is a viable proposition in the contemporary context, from technological, economic, cultural, and social perspectives. Branko Kolarevich is Dean of the Hillier College of Architecture and Design at NYIT. He has taught architecture at several universities in North America and Asia, and has lectured worldwide on the use of digital technologies in design and production. He has authored, edited, and co-edited several books, including Mass Customization and Design Democratization, Building Dynamics, Exploring Architecture of Change, Manufacturing Material Effects, Performative Architecture, and Architecture in the Digital Age. He was elected and served as a president of several organizations: Association of Collegiate School of Architecture, ACSA, Canadian Architectural Certification Board, and the Association for Computer-Aided Design in Architecture, ACADIA. Is the recipient of the Acadia Award for Innovative Research in 2007 and Acadia Society Award of Excellence in 2015. He holds doctoral and master's degree in design from Harvard University and a diploma engineer in architecture degree from the University of Belgrade. Welcome, Branko.
Thank you, Marcella. Thank you, Maria and Pablo, for the invitation to join this distinguished panel today. So as Marcella said, I'm going to talk about mass customization and design democratization today. And actually, the full title is the unfilled promise of mass customization, design democratization being the ultimate goal. Some 2 decades ago, as I was lecturing about parametric design and digital fabrication, I got asked about the social and cultural significance of these technological shifts at the time in the profession and the industry. And my response was that we would see good design being brought to masses, and we would actually see customers, mere customers, become designers, because suddenly they would have access to parametrically designed products where the geometry could be changed on the fly using interactive websites. And then these products could be digitally fabricated, oftentimes locally. So the idea was that whatever data was associated with a particular geometry could be manufactured, whether it's in India, in China, or New York, or Houston, and so on and so forth. And I was convinced that we were on a cusp of a kind of huge social and kind of cultural shift where good design would suddenly be accessible to everyone. And in effect, there was a shift in how products were designed and bought. So there were websites that emerged where people can design shoes or running shoes. One could customize the design of the shoe, the kinds of fabrics that are being used, the colors. You can even put your own logos or your own face if you want on the running shoes. These are kind of some of the designs that Reebok customers made. And as you can see, not all of them are beautiful. It's something that I would kind of return to later on. Even in car industry, you can pick the car you want. You can choose the finishes and what kind of rims you want and this and that. And even when it comes to houses, one has a choice of the house, its features. We'll just go back here. Its features. So this is from Design Your Own Home that is run by Toll Brothers. I mean, the website looks a little different today, but the principle is the same. You get to choose some options, as in this case, you can add the sunroom, or you can add a bay window, or you can add the fireplace, and so on. Blue Homes was one of the pioneers that kind of provided a 3D configuration of the homes. Then we have living homes as another, and so on. So I can kind of offer about a dozen examples of different ventures that were started to kind of offer a degree of customization to customers who are suddenly designers. And in effect, what many of these websites, what many of these providers offered was what I refer to as surface customization. In other words, the customers could select color, material, finishes, but there was no or very limited customization of geometry, like very contrary to what I was expecting to see, say, 2 decades ago. And the question was like, what happened? Why we could not go beyond the kind of paradigm that was born like more than 80 years ago with the Sears homes, where one could, select a house from the catalog, and there was, some ability to customize the finishes even back then. So all we got was a kind of glorified version of the Sears catalog back in the day. This is what I was hoping would happen, that dimensional customization would become the kind of reigning paradigm. And with it, notions, such as meta design that I'll talk about in a second, and the kind of things that I've already explained, where there would be a designer of the system of design, people who would then design specific objects using that system, and where we would actually see the locally produced object at the end. And the kind of most fascinating concept associated with this notion of dimensional customization is meta design, like where a designer would actually design the design process out of which different objects could emerge, where someone would create a kind of design space within which all these objects could exist. And if you think of, let's say, Andrea Palladio, and given that it's Venice Biennale, we can think of the Veneto region, his I Quattro Libri dell'Architettura really is a book, is a set of books on meta design. That is how one can produce Palladian villas that could all be very different by following certain rules and certain parametric rules. So the idea is old, and one can say that Palladio was one of the first meta designers, and one can even go to antiquity and to the Greek temples and so on to kind of find instances of meta design being present. The contemporary version of let's say, Palladian villa would require a kind of a certain parametric minimalism in order for it to be accessible to people. So there would have to be a small number of parameters to vary. There would have to be hierarchies of parameters that one can work with, and there would have to be some kind of simple and engaging interface. And I have yet to see something of this kind emerge, because if you think of, say, a home, there could be literally anywhere, from 100 to several hundred parameters that one could have access to in order to kind of design different aspects of the space. This is a historic example of something that was rather elegantly done, the well-known M table by Fabio Gramazio and Matthias Koller, like the dining table that has holes in it. designed with a kind of state-of-the-art technology in 2005. So this was before the emergence of iPhone and the smartphones. So 3 parameters get set up: length, width, the height, and then the location of the holes in the kind of topography of the table. Some simple parameters were then transmitted to a website where the G code is generated for the milling machine to produce the undulating topography of the underside of the table. And then this is a kind of matrix of customer designed tables where there's 1 hole to as many as 5 holes, and the tables have different shapes and so forth. And so that project brought up really interesting questions to the surface, like whether this is really design beyond control, and should that matter? What is the kind of level of design tolerance that the designers of meta design systems should have? How do you encode good designs? How you code out bad designs? And what is really the nature of the design control? How do you take into account the aesthetic considerations? How do you control what the system could output? How do you verify that what is designed by the customers could perform well? And finally, whether what customers design is producible. So production viability was a kind of another important parameter. And then I thought that these notions of meta design, parametric design, and again, digital fabrication would have a perfect application in the kind of ubiquitous suburban realities of North American cities, where we have this kind of cookie cutter homes, where customers, where typically several different types you can choose from, and then you can choose the paint on the house, or the color of the shingles, the color of the garage door, and so on. And then I kind of thought, what would it take to create a mass customized home? The technologies are there. It is actually economically attainable to have this kind of bespoke home designs. But the question that emerged is whether that is really socially and culturally viable, whether that is the kind of the reality of that we could have now. And then I thought a bit more, what that would entail. So that somebody would have to design a system. Somebody would actually have to work with the customers, because I've realized in dealing with some of the PhD students who explored these topics in the past is that the population at large has no design skills. They do not think that they can design things. They do not think that they don't have confidence in themselves being good designers. So they would turn to people who are architects and ask, do you think this is a good design? Do you think I should do this or that, and so on? And in the end, I kind of came to question the very premise of what I started with 2 decades ago, that design democratization or design democracy could become a kind of a viable social and cultural construct. This got explored. I have to acknowledge the work of my colleague, Jose Duarte from Penn State. So the 2 of us convened a symposium on this very same topic 4 years ago, and we published a book where we kind of explored these questions in depth. So that would be my contribution to our discourse today. And I would bring up this question of design democracy and its viability as, I think, one of the things that we can perhaps discuss. So thank you.
Thank you, Branko. I think you brought a very important subject, why we're still not there, and the democratization of design, I think, is the next barrier that we need to cross. So thank you so much for your social implication presentation. Now we are going to proceed to our last speaker, Andrew Saunders, who's going to present the painterly in the age of brute force computing. Andrew's presentation is going to deal with some issues that are related to history and theory. Heinrich Wölfflin begins his seminal work, Renaissance and Baroque, by laying out a precise definition of the painterly in order to establish how Baroque architecture operates through elusive tendencies akin to the 2-dimensional tropes found in the Baroque painting. Key to Wölfflin's observations and the foundation of formalism was the investment in the 20th century universal science of perception as the means to elevate the study of art from the 19th century connoisseurial status to a more empirical science as a universal field of study. Jumping ahead to the 21st century at the dawn of artificial intelligence, it is striking to see a renewed interest in the field of perception, leading to profound breakthroughs in computation. It is not surprised that arguably some of the most impactful research on deep learning in the past 5 years is being born at the crossroads of computation, neuroscience, and human perception. Associate Professor Andrew Saunders is Director of the Masters of Architecture at the Stuart Weitzman School of Design, University of Pennsylvania. He's also the founding principal of Andrew Saunders Architecture and Design. As a designer, scholar, and faculty member within the discipline of architecture, Saunders specializes in computational geometry as it relates to aesthetics, material culture, and advanced technology and fabrication. His approach to practice, research, and teaching leverages contemporary design technology as a critical lens and design instrument for reassessing how the material culture of architecture and design are generated and conceived. Saunders receives his Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Arkansas and a Master of Architecture with distinction from Harvard Graduate School of Design. Prior to being appointed Associate Professor with tenure at the University of Pennsylvania, he has held teaching positions at a variety of institutions, including the Cooper Union Cranbrook Academy of Art and Head of Graduate Studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in New York. His current research stems from being awarded the competitive 2015 University of Pennsylvania Research Foundation grant for his Baroque topologies digital analysis of the latent topological structure of Baroque architecture to explore how emerging technology, including high-resolution 3D digital scanning and printing, provides unprecedented access to Baroque's architecture's formal complexity, intricate detail, and deep topological structure. The research has been continued additional support funding from the Mellon Grant for Digital Humanities, Mellon Grant for Humanities, Urbanism and Design, as well leading industrial partners, including Faro Technology and Autodesk. Welcome, Andrew, and thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you for that generous introduction, Pablo. Thank you, Maria and Marcella, for inviting me. Wow, what a duty to wrap up this great panel. So we'll get on it. I'm going to share screen. Okay, can you see slide one and another slide? Okay, yeah, thanks. So I titled this kind of talk, it's one that I've been working on quite recently. So looking at the painterly in the age of brute force computing. So the last, I guess, 3 years or so have been a bit consumed by a really vast digital survey of the most important Baroque churches in Rome and then some in the Piedmont area of Italy. This is a book, Baroque Topologies, that I just published that has the work. I think there's certainly similarities that have been addressed throughout a lot of the presentations to the kind of illusionistic principles that were laid out, I guess, starting with Brunelleschi and then through others such as Borromini. This is a kind of area of interest of mine of architectural representation and where these new tools fit within that kind of lineage. And this work is looking at the laser scanner or LiDAR in a representational way. Not only is it just an incredible empirical device for measurement, but I think, and I believe it has, and we as architects have to start to assess its value in terms of architectural representation. So these are kind of a few of the interiors that were scanned in the kind of collection of churches. What I've been trying to do is show these very familiar works in unfamiliar ways, and looking at the technology for different representational modes that it offers. The one before was, these are high resolution meshes that are generated through cloud computing. And they're the interiors of a number of Baroque churches. They're also kind of rendered in orthogonal view. So you're seeing the inside from the outside. This also works with the point cloud data, which you also have the benefit of millions of color. And I think what's interesting is, you know, a number of these churches and architects have been a little bit underrepresented in the past. So it's nice to shed new light on them. These are just a few of the different representational modes that are presented. Again, this is a high density mesh from the scan. These are the interiors of San Maria Piazza in Torino by Bernardo Vittoni. I think this is one of the churches that's severely underrepresented. It's very hard before this point to ever get any documentation on this. These are some of the 3D resin models that we've been printing of the interiors. Certainly they allude to a number of other precedents that are out there, but they're very different in terms of the way in which they receive light with the density of resin. They actually become much darker in the interiors, and the articulation on the exterior is more light and filigree. This is another series of oblique projected views that we've been doing to open these up, re-examine them, understand them on different levels. Borromini to the right and Vittoni to the left of the. Vittoni is, you know, incredible in the way that he's able to delaminate so many layers, and you have all of that kind of on show here as you start to open these up. And so everything that you're seeing up here are the kind of poche spaces between different shells in there. One of the most influential kind of books for me on this research is Henrik Wolfland's Renaissance and Baroque. And of course, you know, there are many criticisms of it, but one of the things that I really admire about this was it was his second book. He was coming off his dissertation in Munich with Theodore Lips as his advisor, titled The Psychology of Architecture. And at that time, they were deeply invested in the psychology of perception and how that could lead to a more universal reading and understanding of art to elevate art history and the teaching of art to a kind of a university level. In order to teach, you are required to produce your dissertation and then also another book. So 1 year after he does his dissertation, he's able to test a lot of these concepts out with the kind of vehicle of Renaissance and Baroque. And in this, he established kind of two terminologies for this, and this is where the definition of the painterly comes. For him, the Renaissance was defined really more as a linear, had linear qualities. And then the Baroque, it had painterly qualities. So in terms of painterly, it was very specific. It was not necessarily anything that was painted, but the painterly were more based on illusionistic principles, trying to make two-dimension appear three-dimension with different illusionistic tricks, typically with you know, number of different variations of chiaroscuro running through. And what's fascinating in the book, you know, I just pulled out all of his terms for the Renaissance. So the Renaissance is linear and therefore more normal, I think, psychologically. It's elegant, harmonious, graceful, light, self-contained, individualistic, tectonic, calm, beautiful, uniform, perfect, born easily, free, complete, broad, pleasing, satisfactory, heavenly, content, slow, quiet, enduring, and fulfilled. And quite opposite, he sets up the Baroque as the painterly that's more pathologic. It's broad, it's massive, it's heavy, it's dissonant, amorphous, formless, imprisoned, unevolved, incomplete, immediate, intimidating, overwhelming, exciting, ecstatic, intoxicating, momentary, desolating, anticipatory, dissatisfactory, restless, and tense. And it's interesting, this is where I'm drawing the kind of parallels. If we look at the kind of most recent developments that are happening within the psychology of perception today, there is an attempt to begin to mimic that biological model of perception through artificial neural networks. This is a short presentation, but one of the big breakthroughs here are at Harvard, Hubble and Weissel. They had developed a device for detecting electrodes in different neurons, and they wanted to test it. They had a lot of cats hooked up and watching screens, and they finally made a breakthrough when the screen slide angle went through and all the neurons went. And so they were able to start to decode and start to map out how the neurons work with complex cells and simple cells in a very advanced kind of neural network. So in 1980, Fukushima was the first person to actually put that into computation, the beginning of being able to simulate this biological model of perception at incredible computational speeds. So today, what we have is quite a few readily accessible models. This one is here, kind of a diagram of breaking down the different layers, but it's interesting how it plays a role with machine learning and machine vision, where the neural network's able to identify certain traits, lines, and marks through chiaroscuro. And similar to the previous kind of analysis of Olfin, looking at those spatial identities, then the networks are able to put them together into different features, eyes, nose, and then finally understand it as a face. So this is running a lot of facial recognition software under Blair. So I went through just quickly as an exercise back to Raphael, the linear, and back to the simple thing, and I slowed down that process of the brute force computing. And what you see is that the neural networks are able to go through the original painting and start to identify those features that are there. And over here is just a sphere to give some sort of shadow and gradient depth. And you can start to see step by step, it continues to start to accrue and put those features on in the same way that it's reading between black and white in this three-dimensional chiaroscuro. So you get all of a sudden all of these elements. We see them from the kind of coffers and vaulting that comes in. And then this one uses the chiaroscuro of the Caravaggio painting, and you can see it also works, but it's really interesting, I find, the way, if you look at the result, how it's mixed facial features with arms, with legs. Different people are put together in different ways. It's very, very bizarre to see the way it's able to detect these features and recompile them in unexpected ways. Here's another example that just looking at multiple spheres, and it's really interesting to see how the figures start to appear in different places, kind of congrued onto those spheres. This is interesting that we see now the knife or sword becomes embedded in different hands, and different faces are put together in these different spheres. So it's been something that I've been working on for the last year, is saying, well, if it can detect certain features and we're training it to see certain things, can we train it to see geometry? And this is coupled with a 8-week first studio in our robotic and autonomous systems, which is a new program that we've just opened at the Weitzman School. And we started the students looking at the ruled surfaces of the constructivist brothers, Nam Gabo and Antoine Pevsner. And the students are able to model those quickly, and they really pair well with the robotic hot wire cutting tool. And you can see this is the geometry. Then we're looking at how do you make that within a figure and cut it within foam. And so these are some of the results of using those original sculptures as tooling paths for the wire cutter. Here's a so the second step is once those geometries were identified and able to be cut, and they're pretty difficult because of the high range of choreography, because the hyperbolic surfaces are quite extreme. But once those were recognized, we're able to put them back into the neural networks and redistribute them in completely different ways. And when they have the rulings on them, they can be identified. So students and researchers, we were then going and finding and recovering the geometry and starting to put it back together. So I've found it quite fascinating. I think that this is a definitely a new heart to whole relationship in terms of what it's expressing, and it's something that we're working on now. But I think just to recap, I'm very struck by how the psychology perception was so incredibly useful at the turn of the century for Wolflin, and now it's certainly becoming a large arena for design again. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thanks for your presentation, very interesting. So we are at the end of the presentations now. We want to thank everyone for the presentation, and we really look forward now to engage in the second phase of this event, which is the panel discussion. So before we start with the discussion, we are really pleased to announce the book publication, and where all of you are part of it. And the book is supported by Dean Perbellini and NYIT-School of Architecture and Design. And really the book, it's a way for us to frame all the work that we have done in the last 2 years within the exhibition, the installation, but also seeing the book as an extension of the symposium and the event today, and see how this can be also a platform for future discussion. So we're very excited to share it with you. I'm going to share quickly the PDF in a moment. So the title of the book is Informing INTERSCALAR Fluidity, and it's edited by myself and Pablo Lorenzo-Eiroa, and will be published very soon by LISLab in Barcelona, so LISLab publisher. So the book discusses informing INTERSCALAR fluidity, and again, expanding computational thinking, but also embedding this notion of interscalarity. And balances the contents related to the installation, but also the exhibition. So in addition to the contributions, the book includes contributions from our Dean, Maria Perbellini, our Chair, Giovanni Santamaria, our Associate Dean, Anthony Caradonna, myself, Pablo Lorenzo-Eiroa, Sergio Elizondo, Ayla Berman, Christina Goberna Pesudo, Branko Kolarevic, Alberto Estevez, Andrew Saunders, and Frederick Lebrat. So all of us continue, let's say, the discussion and this symposium through to another platform. So I'm going to share quickly the PDF of the book. And so the book will be published, as I mentioned, very soon. So it's in formation. And the book includes besides the beginning, the preface, 2 main chapters: urban interscalar fluidity and space environments interscalar fluidity. So as you can see, the book is developed again through the contributed text, but also the work of our students within the 5th year undergraduate thesis and the MArch students. So I want to take also this opportunity to thank the students, particularly first and foremost for really the work and dedication to this project, let's say, that has been an ongoing project since 2019. And so we're really excited to, again, share this with you also because we see this as a strong platform to frame the discussion today and the future discussion and in both academia and pedagogy. So the book will be published internationally and also will be available on Amazon and other platforms, and we'll share information with everyone very soon. Again, this is also an opportunity to thank all of you for the contributed text in the book itself. And also, I would like to share quickly before we go into the installation component, a few slides that are now being exhibited in, let me share screen again, in Venice as we speak, in the in Palazzo Bembo. So these some are the images some of the images presented right now in Venice, and these are the body of work developed by the students, developed within the undergraduate design studio led by visiting professor Sergio Elizondo and myself in the MArch program. So this is the content specific of the exhibition. And after this, Pablo will introduce quickly the installation as a supporting platform for the contents. So you will see more of this in the book. So again, thank you for contributing to the book, and I want to thank the dean, but also the students participating in this project.
Thank you, Marcella. I'm going to now quickly, because we're running a little bit out of time, but I'm going to run quickly through the work that we did with the students at the thesis level at the undergraduate of the School of Architecture and Design. We work with artificial intelligence, recognizing weather patterns and conditions of landscape, which we then enfolded back into the really tiny little room at Palazzo Bembo. For instance, the idea was not only to recognize environmental problems, but activate them at the level of the microenvironment of the room. So in order to do that, we ran different types of simulations. So the students work with several correlational simulations, which they start interacting with each other. So for instance, we developed some research in terms of material that is able to absorb heat and be able to actually promote a microenvironment within the installation, as well as structural simulation of different kinds, but looking for a certain artistic and cultural autonomy independent from the technology's use. And also being critical of the technology, avoiding a technological determinism in order to activate problems back and forth between construction, fabrication, robotic interactivity, and the space of installation. So here we have some examples of the work. So for instance, when we started prototyping, there were nonlinear relationships between the intelligence of the system produced, but also how that was being built, deviating from the original premises and activating a loop between fabrication and representation. And also that was done at the level of the space. Currently, we have a small portion of it. We're in phase 1. We're going to continue working through the summer as we grow with it. But for instance, we included interactivity, sensing the space, but also feedbacking into the space. Matching the perspectival cone of vision with the audible cone of vision. So for instance, working at the coding of the audible level of the space. We also work with animations that run forever, for instance, like they can continue running forever till the infinite, such as the vanishing point. So we try to coordinate the technology with the viewing of the space. And also the growth of the installation and the growth of the geometry is also part of that process, right? A growing system that also starts criticizing its own subdivisional surface. So for instance, we developed a way to go beyond the initial parameters by creating topology through the growing cells that we were working with. So it's not only emergent geometry, but the emergent geometry starts taking over its initial parameters. And here I have some images of the virtual part. The virtual part is expanded in terms of visual, but also virtual reality and an accentuated vision of the space itself. So the geometry is distorted physically and also virtually in order to address different aspects of the relationship between the actual physical space, the space that is distorted physically in order to accentuate the perspective, and the projected space in the animations that is interactive, but also the virtual reality that plays on top of all these levels. Just quickly some images. You can retrieve the virtual reality model, and here I'm going to just quickly show a small fast animation of the relationships that I'm describing, right? The space is really tiny. We have a space to compare the actual size next door. Right now, our voices and faces are being replicated here. There is an actual real-time projection of our conversation in the space next door. And these are actually virtual simulations of the robotic fabrication. So we work also constructing, but also because COVID did not allow us to construct all the installation, we work critically by constructing the drawing as a three-dimensional simulation of the construction, right? So there is a confluence also at the representation level between the multiple aspects, and you can navigate, you can move around the installation. So thank you for all the panelists for your presentations. And now I'm going to stop sharing and we enter into the moderated discussion. So I think, Marcella, you want to start with the first question to our panelists.
Thanks, Pablo. So we will start now with some questions and then we will open up to the audience. So I will start with the first question. So to start to pick up on some of the themes emerging from the presentation that we have seen today, from transcoding to simulation, appropriation, replication, production of copies, as well as expanded intelligence emerging from computational system of representation. I would like to start the first question to propose a reflection on the aesthetic of the code that is not directly linked with the generative aspect of coding by introducing the notion of metamodel. And I think this might link a little bit what Branko was describing. The notion of metamodel, as used by Guattari, is used really to oppose to the assumption that models are closed and predetermined formal systems, simulation-based patterns of recognition, or cultural, aesthetic, and political schema governing society. So a metamodel here is understood as a model that goes beyond already determined possibilities. Referencing Luciana Parisi on her book on computational culture, on the contrary, a metamodel proposed soft modes of thought, opening to indeterminacy. I think we saw also this in the presentation today, where numerical speculation was aesthetic side relies not on their visual perceptible interface, but primarily on the abstractness of the conceptual algorithm in processing of data. So all of this brings to the question, so how do you see the potential of coding to produce a system of possibilities for reality that are not simply representational? And in particular, how do you see this potential within our discipline as able to produce speculative novelties?
Anybody can jump in, right?
Yes.
I can jump in if you want. Okay, so I think that the question of coding, it's actually very relevant today in the moment that we are right now, because at the end of the day, coding is the transformation through a set of rules, right? And rules right now obviously have to change, and we have to change. I mean, architectural thinking should change too, obviously. because we are in a historical moment of a very dramatic moment where with COVID-19, where all the planet had paused completely. And it is also a very fascinating moment, I believe, because it requires a very big effort on radical imagination. So I think that it's the best moment to think about the transformation through new set of rules. And I think that us as designers have to be in the conversations that had to do with design at different scales, in all the conversations that had to do with the design of cities, for example, with the design of other things, with technologies that sometimes we are pushed aside in a way. So I think that the idea of coding, generally speaking, should be in the core of the conversation, definitely. Yes, I think that it has a great potential.
Let me just wait for it. Oh, go ahead.
Oh. So I think the idea of the Metamodel is a great one. You know, I was referring to the idea that we've shifted from the design of an object or the design of things to the design of a system, and which really, in the end, becomes the design of the code, but it's even more than that, because it's the selection of multiple parameters, which also include the materialities of a system, etc. And I think some of the questions that exist now, because it is sort of infinite and open-ended, you know, designing a system is incredibly complex. I mean, Branko referred to the question of expertise. Where does the expertise exist in relation to design? How do we rethink even how we are teaching design when it is about designing a system rather than simply designing a thing? And you know, the questions around not just the technology, but questions that came out in many of the presentations. What constitutes the aesthetics? You know, what constitutes good design within this? How do we determine the questions around the parameters themselves, and the nature of the complexity that gets produced? The inputs, I think, become absolutely critical as well. But it's really about how we start to think about the evaluation of the systems and the things that they produce.
Branko, you're muted.
There is actually, sorry, there is an interesting connection to this discourse related to meta models and meta design. Ayla chaired the conference, ACSC conference in San Francisco in 2013. And there was a couple of professors from University of Arkansas who shared in a session the work of their studio, where they were trying to abuse parametric models that were kind of created by their students, and created all sorts of monstrosities. Let's call them monstrosities, because they were out of control designs. They were incredibly interesting visually, but if one were to kind of exercise extreme control, they would never be born, so to speak, out of that procedure. And then they also shared examples from their own practice where they were designing tiling patterns for public bathrooms. I forgot where the location was. And they had 7 explicit rules that they thought could never be abused. And to their astonishment, what the workers produced on-site was mind-boggling in terms of irregularity, in terms of the kind of how they were breaking out of the system, that they actually coded like simple 7 written instructions for the construction crew on site. So from my perspective, this issue of control in the process, and Andrew's work is really interesting, comes to the foreground. To what extent we do want to have full agency of control over what gets produced by the systems. That's, from my perspective, one of the kind of most interesting questions to explore.
I think, Branko, thank you for that answer, because that gives me the advantage to be able to go to the next question, which is, what happens when there is that type of feedback that you're saying in terms of, because computation historically has been a machine for predetermination. In other words, you have to compute the software in advance, anticipating the issues that are going to be happening by the user using the software, right? And that notion has been changing radically in the last 10 years with real-time simulation. And real-time simulation is not only used, for those of you that maybe are not so familiar, is not only used in terms of what I presented today relative to environmental systems, but also in terms of real-time computation. For instance, the fact that our computers are real-time connected and we are being spied, right, by Microsoft and all the systems, the computational system is being optimized by our use, breaking that notion of linearity between determination and non-determination. In that sense, that's what we are trying to work through when we talk about simulation, right? The issue that a simulation, for instance, conceptually, is an emergent system that in some types of computation, such as, for instance, the older cellular automation, is site-based computation, right? The conditions change, the computational system evolves as it changes. So the question here is relative to the notion of openness and non-determination, which is one of the things that, to me, I'm interested in the most, because I think architects who have been working in the last 20, 30 years with apparently non-deterministic architecture, when in reality we use deterministic computational systems, right? So we claim that at a typological level, our architecture is non-deterministic in terms of how it looks like and what it does to the space, but in reality we use systems that are deterministic. And that has been changing the last 10 years. So I want to ask the participants how you see that changing, right? How the issues of optimization relative to algorithms working real time is changing design and even the notion of design in architecture today.
I just want to jump in there, Pablo. That's a great question. I was thinking, when I know you guys are designing a new program, new graduate program, and we were doing the same there. And Robert Stewart Smith, who I saw in a number of his works in Isla's first presentation, who is now directing that program, it's the RAS, and it wasn't going to be robotic and automated systems, right? It had to be robotic autonomous systems. So, I mean, I think that's really what you're talking about, the deterministic versus the autonomous. I feel like, whenever this gets brought up within, artificial intelligence, these kind of things, there's a tendency, obviously, within the kind of sci-fi world to fast forward to a singular arena that's dangerous when human participants are no longer in it. But that's, a far way off. Right now, we're in this kind of multiplicity time when humans work with autonomous systems in a productive way, I would argue. And that would just be the question for me. I'm finding in my own personal work that I'm really completely curious about the way some of these autonomous systems are able to do things, coupled with the brute force nature that they can learn fast because they do things over and over and over and over so fast, which has always been something about computation, but the learning that comes out of that and the ability just to do hard tasks and produce other things that I don't know if anyone would want to do as a person is really incredible from my perspective. So some people call it collaboration. I'm not sure if that's the correct term. I don't think it's that genuine as a collaboration, but somewhere in there, I think, lies this kind of really new, interesting state where we are.
Yeah, I mean, if I may jump in, I wouldn't be so optimistic. I think all of you are amazing researcher trying to look at the edge that you can find, but coding is a very complex, difficult condition, and when it gets made available to the kind of mass customer, it's usually in a very homogeneous form, and very few people feel they can interact and interfere with the code. We find that in the way large software are being used, such as AutoCAD or any of those things, which we should remember. The Rhino or Formsy or whatever, when it came out, were also beta tested, were new things, were amazing thing that could be transformed. I mean, I remember going to the headquarters of Formsy with some work we were doing with Eisenman, and they were convinced we're using another software. We couldn't use their software to do what we were doing. So yes, we can push the code, but then when you look at it, at some point it becomes a system that has, in that sense, an aesthetic of the code and a structure and a feasibility and kind of a collective cultural acceptance of what is what, to be able to negotiate between, let's say, contractor and client and professional. And it's I mean, I don't know, I'm not that optimistic. I mean, I feel like there were a lot of programs that slowly are being erased to become, I mean, when we look at fairly simple thing like rendering and things like that, there's a conventionality that is pretty scary in a way.
But actually, Fred, I agree. That's why in our new program, we are developing our own systems in order to address that. Because, and actually I wrote extensively, I remember in Acadia 2010, that people were a little bit upset that we raised that issue of authorship, right? The fact that if you are a designer using a package, you're not really the author, right? The ideology comes in advance, right? And the designers really were uncomfortable with that. And I think that that notion today is changing because open source, right, and open systems are addressing what you're saying. And I think that that's the critical aspect that I was referring to. How do you deal with a non-deterministic condition to actually expand authorship in relationship to the system that you're using?
I mean, I agree with you that, but you are such a tiny percentage where you have the luxury of having academia, having sponsored studio, etc., to do that research. I'm afraid that the vast majority of people are going to use things like they're using their iPhone or they're using their Excel spreadsheet or whatever, which has a preset system of value, preset system of aesthetic, preset system of code in that sense that is encoded into the algorithm that is going to be very, very difficult to modify. And I really appreciate you and people who are trying to work at the edge and pushing that. But the large majority is going to, so the question is, who is developing this aesthetic of the code?
Yeah. I think this brings up, you know, the difference between what we mean by encoding and what we mean by transcoding. I think that's a very different way of looking at the agency of control, I think, as Branko was saying. So to me, encoding, it's more a deterministic approach versus transcoding. It's about the translation from let's say, the movement or the translation from a system to another system. And I think this, again, start to bring in really the dichotomy, I would say, between infinite and open-end possibilities versus closed system and more deterministic.
I would maybe just put a proposal on the table that whether or not something becomes deterministic or non-deterministic, for me is less the issue, because I would say non-determinism, you know, will not necessarily save us, you know, in the same way that chaos won't. And I'm brought back to an early, one of the early writings from the Logics of Sense by Deleuze, writing about, you know, games of skill versus games of chance. And I think that for me, it's very interesting, you know, where chance intervenes, but of course, how we operate within design, whether it's in relation to, you know, parameters for encoding or transcoding in this case. What are the skills, you know, that we are bringing to the table in the invention of the system, and whether those are aesthetic or in relation to fulfilling certain kinds of outcomes, whatever those outcomes might be. I think that's part of what becomes critical in this. You know, what are the objectives of what we are trying to do, and how we're using the system. Because I think that for me, it really is the difference in changing how we think about the process but not assuming that a move from, you know, a machine that might have produced a very specific type of thing, or a model that had only a specific set of elements that might be produced, to something that becomes infinite, will itself be, you know, be liberating, because we could produce a lot of garbage, you know, through that process. So I'm highly optimistic, but I'm really interested in the specificity, you know, of the ways in which we start to use and design the new systems and tools themselves.
Mhm.
If I can add a little thing, because maybe this question about not deterministic, maybe not determinism don't exist, because if we see in genetics, when in the last times the research in genetics goes deeper and deeper, they begin to grow a theory about genetics is following a kind of arrow of evolution. So at the end is all following a determinism that maybe when we are translating this in the computational world, maybe in deeper research we can find that also what we call now no deterministic is also determinate.
Maybe there you bring in a very interesting question, because also, I mean, it happens in many disciplines, by the way. So for instance, there are mathematicians that think that mathematics is a discovery, number one, right? And there are mathematicians that think that mathematics is just a linguistic system of coding, right? That only is primary for humans, right? That if an alien comes into Earth, they will not be doing mathematics the way that we are doing. So our most abstract and objective system of cognition may be cultural based, right? So in that sense, I want to continue with what Alberto is saying, and I partially agree and I partially disagree because of what's happening now with artificial intelligence, right? That on the one hand, coming back to the problem of ideology, right? Like there is an ideology implicit in the way that we are constructing the canvas space in each of the software, right? And that ideology is actually very conventional, if you think about it, right? From a programmer point of view, telling architects what architecture should be in a kind of manner, right? So I'm talking about predetermination. I speak about linguistic structures, right? Like how do we address the world, which signs, and that's even if you think in terms of evolution, there is no non-determination, there is a relationship between deterministic systems that we invent an origin, even if the origin doesn't exist, we are inventing an origin, right, artificially, and non-determination in terms of chaos theory that Ayla was mentioning relative to, you know, after the second collision in particles, right, there is no way to predict the state unless you run the simulation, right? So in that sense, there is a very interesting problem in simulation that you run it once and it's supposed to be once and forever. You cannot really, unless you replicate exactly the initial conditions, that cannot happen again. But in terms of, I think that what's happening now, and this is the next question relative to big data, what has been happening since 2013 approximately, artificial intelligence, what are the biases? How do we address what's currently at stake, I think, everywhere relative to how we are using, how we are actually victims and how we are using artificial intelligence now, which is a little bit the question that Boyega is asking in the chat, right? Like how do we address the biases? How do we think about the initial parameters? If you are working with simulation, the problem are the initial parameters, right? If we're working with artificial intelligence, the problem is how the data set is being trained and how the tagging is happening, right? Because tagging is happening with very deterministic categories, and the neural networks are being trained, accentuating, by the way, when you see the result, there's an accentuation of the biases of how the data tagging has been happening, right? So how do we address determination and non-determination relative to what's going on in artificial intelligence, if somebody wants to jump into?
Nobody is telling nothing, only a little thing. We are now in, I think, in a very interesting moment because we begin to feel a kind of convergence of all these concepts that we was thinking maybe 20 years ago that are different: global, local, biology, digital, virtual, real, all these questions, yeah, natural intelligence, artificial intelligence. But now, 20 years later, it's a kind of convergence of all these concepts. It's not more biology digital, it's biodigital. It's not more global local, it's glocal. It's not more virtual real, it's virtual real. It's so this happens, I think, also will happen, I think, in the development of artificial intelligence referred to natural intelligence.
Let me just offer kind of a few musings on this topic. We kind of pursue AI in our context for its capacity to deliver something novel, something that was not or cannot be foreseen in kind of more conventional ways of working. If you think of Andrew's work, like, you know, what is the connection between the sphere or 9 spheres and the images that he was working with? So there is a kind of degree of whim in what is brought into the kind of production process, what he particularly chose to work with. And the end result, there were some few leaps into the process, like, is beautiful. So it's like, I'm not actually interested in how he got there. I'm really interested in what he kind of produced. And there is a kind of beautiful quality to what resulted, you know, from the exercise. What I'm actually much more interested in is to go back to Fred's notion of writing our own code. You know, early in my career, I actually learned AI programming languages, Prolog and Lisp. And what was beautiful about them is that you can change code on the fly. The program itself can rewrite itself as it executes, as it encounters things around it. And to me, that was a kind of fascinating concept, that you have a highly deterministic procedural construct that begins to operate, and as it operates, begins to change itself. We have that kind of in the processes that we use in our design, but it will be interesting to see that coded, to see that written in some code done by some designer, because from my perspective, that will be kind of a true use of AI languages. Right now, we are simply appropriating ordinary technologies, you know, that we can get our hands on and kind of using them just like we used computer animation in the past to create a kind of something that has an element of novelty to it, something that was not seen in the past. So it's very conventional, I would say, our appropriation of the AI technology today.
You know, Branko, it's an interesting topic because I remember years ago having a conversation with a computer scientist, or the head of computer science department, who basically said that we were users, you know, of computation as opposed to designers of it. They were the designers, you know, even though I would, and as architects and designers, you know, we use tools that are also created with a user interface that we can understand, you know, that Grasshopper becomes visualized, right? But the question for me is, you know, I don't necessarily think that architects and designers need to become coded, because I think the question of bias is a really important one. You know, we know that within the predetermination of linguistic structures, it's not the idea that I have an infinite capacity to say things, right, within the existing linguistic structures. But the challenge is not that. It's the challenge that language privileges certain conditions over others. You know, it removes the aesthetic, the formally motivated, etc. So I'm always thinking about how genetic models or coded models operating within architecture and design have other kinds of biases. We could say the biases might be numerical, but for me, it's more that that it, on the one hand, simulates a form of material model because of its ability to compute just an incredible amount of information and data, right? So I used to say that so many of our practices, despite the fact that they don't produce Cartesian objects, are still operating based on Cartesian systems, like the layering of 3D printing. It's just that it has become so microscopic that the amount of information that's contained within the system starts to appear to operate the way in which materials do. And that would be, for me, one of the biases within this genetic code is that it simulates a material model without necessarily operating from the logics of matter. And I'm interested in that question, you know, where materials themselves provide resistances. So in one of the images that I showed of the exhibition, it's the moment where gravity and the actual fluidity of the material starts to transform the artifact that exceeds the code. And that's a form of, another form of non-determination that exists outside of the computational realm. And those are the things that for me are really interesting to think about, perhaps less than us becoming coder. But I am interested in us becoming users, that as users actually start to design those systems, working with coders perhaps through that process.
The question, Ayla, that I have then, before we go to the final that Marcella is about to ask another question is, how do we expand dimensions? At least that I've been trying to expand dimensions related to Cartesian space. How do you expand dimensions when you find that that's a problem? And how do you expand language? Because, and then there is a problem of not only coding, but the, you know, the elements that you use to code, right? And I think that para-language is something that I think is necessary actually to code. And I think happening in all the disciplines, not only in architecture, that I think that as we expand our realities, we need to expand the systems of how we describe that reality, not only through the technology, but also expanding our cultural apparatus, such as language. But Marcella, I think you want to continue. Yeah.
I wish we had more time and continues this discussion more. So I will end with a question before opening up to the audience that zoom out a little bit and is more related to the notion of interscalarity, which is the framework of the exhibition. And so within the exhibition, we have embraced the notion of interscalarity more as a methodological framework. And that really was able to act as a lens to investigate scalar relationships, but also very importantly understand, develop this notion of codependency that relates to material, spatial, social, cultural, political, economic, and environmental concerns. So both scalar relationship, but also this notion of codependency. So in the exhibition and the work, somehow this notion of interscalarity is developed with the idea of micro to macro continuum to be able to uncover possibilities and relations really to foster design scenario that are able to work across scale, time, protocols, and agencies. So how do you see, and again, here I think maybe we can expand a little bit more, going into pedagogy, or again, going to methodological framework. So how do you see the interscalarity as a methodological framework as a way to foster codependency of parameters, but also be able to propose a broader systemic approach for design?
Let me wade into that a little bit. As somebody who was interested with material dynamics in the past, the issue of scale was really crucial, and issue of scale is absolutely essential in what we do, let's say in the context of architecture. And there is a fascination, for example, with biological scale, and Alberto spoke about that. Like things that operate at that scale do not necessarily operate at the scale of let's say micro, milli, let alone giga, mega, and so on. And I have discovered that it's not a discovery, it was rather obvious in working with students. They make assumptions about the kind of linearity in scalar relationships. So if something works at 1 to 10 scale, you know, I should expect it to work at 1 to 10 scale, or let's say 100 to 1 scale. So I think one of the first things that we have to kind of dispel, at least in the pedagogic context, and still have to do that, is this notion of a linear relationship related to scale. And it's a kind of eye-opening experience for students to engage in this kind of scalar explorations. So I will leave that as a kind of opening comment for the conversation.
Yeah, I agree absolutely, because for example, if you see the science fiction movies that an ant or a spider becomes big, and you know that this is not possible because the structure collapses. So if you go again to nature, and you can learn how nature is managing the different scales by changing the structure, by changing the system. And this is when I was speaking some time ago, that why we are making massive columns, for example, when we have now the technology for make fractal columns that not needs to be massive. So it's a point for education, yes, that the students know this necessarily change in systems when they change the scales. No?
Maybe I could add just two thoughts. On the one hand, you know, the examples given speak to the idea of scale as part of the material real. Scale is real. And I think that's an important consideration because things transform, materials transform, obviously, when we change scale. When we think about the microscopic logics of our bodies, they're different, right, than the logics at the scale of organs, the scale of body, etc. I always, whenever I think about scale, the Eames power of 10 always sort of comes to mind, right? As opposed to the fractal idea of scaling, where the thing stays the same no matter what scale you're operating at. And I think just the idea that scale is part of the material real, for me, means it's part of what we operate with. But it doesn't mean that that the collapsing of scales that we are now engaging with, even, you know, this event, you know, that we can project our eyes and ears sort of out into the world and collapse the globe instantaneously, is part of that linking and stretching of scale, which I think is sort of fascinating. But I think it has to be thought. You know, it has to be thought critically in relation to what are those things that are being brought together and why.
Yes, I would like to add something to this last question as well. I think that the interscalarity in design is fundamental because, I mean, I'm sure that you have observed that many times one of the dangers of the students or designers not taking into consideration different scales, urban scale versus human scale, etc., is that they could get absolutely obsessed with form, for example, without taking into consideration all the consequences of their own decisions. So the fact that there is there is the potential of coexistence, codependency of certain data parameters, but also certain statements and ideological positions in different scales make our understanding of the world, but also the students' understanding of their design in a much richer way. And I think that it's a way of enriching education for sure. And it's a big danger when this multiscalarity disappears somehow. And I'm sure that you have observed it very often, no? So I think that it's also like a great addition.
Bye, Alberto. So we can end, I think, with we can only take one question from the audience, and we have one question in the chat, and then we'll close with that. And one is from our chair, Giovanni Santamaria, that says, from models to open and interactive methodology, how do we establish parameters of reference that are shared and coherently understood? And who decides where to stop the process?
You know, on the one hand, I would say this question of parameters of reference that are shared and coherently understood, we always have a challenge within our disciplines, because I would argue that on the one hand, the push for creating something that is new or original automatically means moving into the unknown, the thing that has yet to be seen or yet to be understood, and is therefore going to operate outside of a shared frame of reference, you know, and that's one of the challenges for us. It's even the idea within artificial intelligence that as soon as something is created within AI, or AI is able to do some fundamental operation, it's no longer considered part of artificial intelligence, you know, and that it's always evolving in that way. And I think that, so that's one of the challenges that comes back to this idea that we operate within this set of shared cultural myths, but we're always pushing the boundaries of those myths in order to create new ones. But on the other hand, I would say we also operate in a world that's different than language, is something that we can respond to, you know, not perhaps within the realm of recognition, but within the realm of experience, perception, etc. And that will, in my mind, is always going to expand certain pre-existing knowledges that we have and pre-existing conditions of recognition. You know, where we stop the process, I think in the end, that's up to us.
Agree.
Yeah, I think the question of which parameter, you know, socially, politically, what do we include in the discussion? Obviously, a lot of those parameters originally are kind of minor, but it's something we find in other kind of coding. If you look at the zoning code or things like that, for me, it's very interesting to look at maps. What maps used to represent was, you know, if you take the sandboard map or something like that, the parameters that were included were legal boundary, economy, and ultimately those parameters of value. What kind of value do we want to play with? And very often those values become, you know, this little dollar sign, and the value is how much money can you make out of the real estate or whatever. So the question is, how do we, you know, I want to go back to Bergson and this idea of educating our perception filter, educating what value has what value, how do we value the values? And I think that's very important to show that there's possibility to transgress a preconceived notion of, okay, this has value, this doesn't have value. And I think it's very important that through this computation, we can open up to parameters that are much more diverse, much more complex than just the traditional typical one.
You know, in terms of value, Fred, the question is the validation systems, which are themselves measuring systems, right? So that's what's at stake, I think, today. And relative, Ayla, with what you were saying about, I think that one option could be what's happening with AI. I think that at least the people that are working on the foreground of the AI research is the, you know, on the one hand, there is a cybernetic approach on, you know, building neural connections in relationship to emerging problems. So the certain connections become active in relationship to certain knowledge that, you know, so that's purely emerging at the engine level. But or at the same time, you know, the more artificial approach is thinking about algorithms that self-edit through optimization, which is the kind of other approach that I think actually presented a different notion of what AI is today relative to the notion of the cybernetics of the 60s. So I think that we are today, I think relative to what Fred, you were just saying, is the validation system, right? Like, and that's when the culture hits us back. And I think that that's the problem of science today, in a way, right? That they have a problem also. We don't only have a problem, but they also have a problem, which is even the way papers are being written or the validation systems of measurement that are being used, right? They all hit us back with cultural issues that I think need to be addressed at many multiple levels. And I think AI is accelerating that kind of dark mirror in a way, right? So, but we ran a little bit out of time, half an hour. So we thank you for your patience and we thank you for your bright participation. I thought that this was a great, great panel. So
thank you, everyone.
Yes.
We look forward to share with you the book and continue the discussion in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yes, the book is looking promising. So